circumstances did the first human being reach the terrible decision that it was okay to reduce other human beings to slavery? We've no idea, but slavery was definitely being practiced in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC by the Mesopotamians, by the Egyptians, and later by the early Hebrews. It certainly wasn't the Greeks who invented slavery, though the Greeks get a particularly bad rap, because to their cost, being a highly articulate and literate people, they just happen to have provided us with a full record of how slavery functioned in their world. As we've already seen, slavery existed in Greece in the Mycenaean period from around 1600 BC. By the end of the 8th century BC, at the very latest, slavery was so much a part of everyday life that even if you had been poor, you'd have owned a slave. We know that for a fact because the poet Hesiod, author of an epic poem called The Works and Days, a kind of farmer's almanac, takes it for granted that even a peasant farmer will own a slave. Already by the 8th century too, slavery rather than wage labor was the most common form of dependent labor in the Greek world. As the historian Paul Cartledge has noted, however, slavery in antiquity covered a multitude of sins and life chances. The ideal type of the slave is the socially dead chattel ripped forcibly from organic ties of kin and community, transported to an alien environment, there to be treated as merely a piece of property or as a factor of production to be used and abused at will. An inanimate tool or beast of burden with no sense of self other than that allowed by the slave owner, and no legal, let alone civic personality whatsoever. But no slave fitted this ideal type, and this is really an essential point to note. Slavery had, in fact, many faces, many conditions, and many statuses. It wasn't the case that you were either free or a slave. On the contrary, there was what one scholar has aptly called a continuum of unfreedom. And as we shall see, some slaves actually did okay by the standards of the day. So today, you're going to be a Greek slave. And not surprisingly, you won't find the time or the means to leave us an account of your life. We don't have a single testimony from any period written by a Greek slave telling us what she or he felt about being a slave. Slaves make a few brief appearances in literature and very occasionally too in art. Philosophers sometimes discuss slavery in an abstract way, but never with any insight into the feelings of slaves. So what we have to go on is admittedly minimal. Even so, we can build up a pretty clear picture of the daily life of slaves, even though we can't get into their heads. What we can do, however, is get inside the heads of Greeks who own slaves, which is what I want to invite you to do now. From childhood upwards, you've grown up with slaves. All your friends own slaves. There isn't a single person in the entire Greek world, so far as we know, who advocated the abolition of slavery, and you certainly don't. It would never cross your mind to do so. That makes Greek slavery a very different kind of phenomenon from slavery in the antebellum South. Even if you're a really nice Greek man or woman, which of course you are, it would never ever have occurred to you to question the necessity, the inevitability, or the essential rightness of slavery. The best we could expect of you is that you'll act decently and humanely towards your own slaves. It's true that the 5th century BC comic dramatist Crates does, in one of his plays, fancifully imagine a world so technologically advanced that all you have to do is pronounce a command and it happens automatically. A table, lay yourself. A mixing bowl, pour the wine. Meat dish, serve the beef, says one of his characters. But that hardly amounted to empathizing with a slave, and it certainly wasn't an argument for abolishing slavery. Crates was merely envisaging a world that could dispense with slaves, and that's something entirely different. Even if you had the greatest brain in the world, you still wouldn't be able to think yourself outside the box. A common, if not universal, failing of human beings throughout history, as we've seen already. In the Politics, Aristotle differentiated between what he called slaves by nature, i.e. those born in captivity, and slaves by law, i.e. those captured in war or acquired through piracy and sold into slavery. Well, you didn't have to be a genius to realize that those who were born free but ended up slaves did so as the result of happenstance, whereas those who were born into slavery from the start belonged to a substratum of the human race. The proof for this, let's consult Aristotle. Just look at their bodies, Aristotle said. The fact that they're often misshapen proves conclusively they were indeed born to be slaves. Well, Aristotle, great mind that he was of course confusing cause with effect. Of course their bodies are going to become misshapen if you give them back-breaking work to do. Slaves also lack the faculty of deliberation, Aristotle averred. Of course they do, you prize chump. They don't have any leisure, and what on earth would they deliberate about anyway? Aristotle was a great one for defining things, and the choice phrase he came up with to define a household slave was ktema empsukon, a piece of property that breathes, meaning that a slave is in the same category as a chair or a table, with the exception that it, the slave, happens to be endowed with life. Well, I'm being hard on Aristotle because he happens to have articulated his thoughts about slavery, but he was no different from any other Greek. It's that mindset thing at work again. And if someone as smart as Aristotle was stuck inside his head, it's safe to assume that every other Greek would have been as well. Before I talk about your life as a slave, I want to give you some idea of the size of the slave population in Greece. Nobody, of course, kept a register of slaves, not even the Athenians, who, as ever, provide us with the best evidence. But Paul Cartledge, whom I quoted a moment ago, drawing on comparative data from modern slave societies, including Brazil, the Caribbean, and the antebellum South, estimates, I quote, that between 450 and 320 BC, there were about 80,000 to 100,000 slaves out of a total population of perhaps 250,000. That's to say, somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 3 of the Athenian population were slaves. Moses Finley, who pioneered the study of Greek slavery back in the late 1950s, Greek historians before his time had been rather embarrassed for the Greeks and so avoided the subject, went so far as to say, "We can take it as a rule that any free man who could possibly afford one owned a slave attendant who accompanied him when he walked abroad in the town or when he traveled, and also a slave woman for his household chores." So owning a slave was very much like owning a car in our society. If you were well-to-do, however, you probably owned 2 or 3, whereas if you were seriously rich, you owned between 10 and 20. As I've already indicated, as a slave, you don't have any social, legal, or political persona. What that means is that you have no family, no rights under the law, no political identity. You can be beaten at your owner's will, and you can be forced into a non-consensual sexual relationship. If you're called to give testimony in a lawsuit, you can only do so under torture, which was intended to get you to spill the beans by either confessing to your own guilt or by incriminating someone else. To us, torture in such circumstances seems not only inhumane, but also counterproductive. In the eyes of the Greeks, however, a slave was incapable of distinguishing truth from falsehood, and worse, perfectly prepared to lie just for the hell of it. Remember, as Aristotle said, you lack the faculty of deliberation. So unless he was tortured, the court wouldn't know whether he was telling the truth or not. What the Greeks didn't realize is that people will say anything under torture merely to get the torture to end. In sum, you were largely invisible, both literally as well as metaphorically, because you lack what we would call personhood. As I've already indicated, however, Greek slavery was not an absolute condition, and we should not treat Greek slaves as an undifferentiated mass. Moreover, the bleakness of the picture I've just drawn needs to be somewhat qualified and ameliorated. Given the prevalence of hardship, poverty, and disease in the ancient world, Greece included, you might actually prefer being a slave to being a freeman. When Odysseus encounters Achilles in the underworld in Book 11 of the Odyssey, the latter says that he would rather be a man who works for someone else rather than lord of all the dead. Significantly, he doesn't say he'd rather be a slave, presumably because being a slave would be preferable to being a hired hand, not least in terms of job security. Though we should also bear in mind the possibility that an aristocrat like Achilles was incapable of imagining coming back to earth in the guise of a slave. It's clear, even so, from the statement, one, that the Greeks considered it to be a total disgrace for a free man to work for another, and two, that slavery provided some measure of economic security in a dangerous and unpredictable world. So, let's now look at the various types of jobs that you might be required to perform as a slave. Let's suppose, to start with, that you're a domestic, a ktema emsukon, a piece of property that breathes, as Aristotle put it. In other words, you're an example of the most advanced labor-saving device that the Greek world ever produced. You may be a cook, a gardener, a porter, a cleaner, a washer, a reader, a scribe, a nurse, both of children and of the sick, an escort, a messenger, a traveling companion, a fetcher and carrier, or pretty much all of the above rolled into one. Your quality of life depends very much on the luck of the draw. With good luck, your master or your mistress will be humane and treat you, within strict limits of course, like one of the family. He or she wouldn't want you to get uppity, however, and irrespective of how they actually treated you, you would, to some extent, have been officially integrated into the oikos or oikia, the household and family. It's oikos and oikia that give us our word economy, which literally means the proper running of a household. The fact that you were officially integrated into the oikos is demonstrated by your participation immediately after you had been acquired in a religious ceremony by which you officially became an oikites, which means a person of the oikos. And the ceremony you went through was very similar to the one performed on behalf of a newborn baby when it was incorporated into the family at the amphidromia, which I talked about in the previous lecture. Over time, too, you may develop a close tie with your master or mistress. And that's particularly likely if you have to look after the children, either as a female nurse or as a male paidagogos. A paidagogos means literally someone who accompanies a child, though in practice such a slave often functioned as a tutor. And that's how we get the words pedagogue and pedagogy.